America's women achievers become leaders. And she originally wrote this book more than a decade ago, but it's also been updated. And she also has been the host of two casts, Game Changers podcast of the International Women's Forum, and also Power Up Women. And earned more of her early business credentials at Ford Motor Company, communications and governmental affairs executive, and was named by Automotive News to its first 100 leading women in the automobile industry. And following her early retirement, she ran for office, serving 4 years for the Auburn Hills City Council. And that's when she wrote Powering Up in her spare time. She's been a respected voice for women and girls. She's been a keynote speaker on 6 continents, and she and I are members together of the International Women's Forum, which is a global organization of women who are preeminent in their field. And she's also been part of the Detroit Police Athletic League, PAL. She chairs the Game Changer Board Committee, and which works to increase PAL's sports and entertainment opportunities for girls. She was an honors graduate of the University of Michigan. She studied at the University of Madrid as she goes to Spain from time to time, just for fun or for months at a time. And she also completed graduate work at Northwestern, Harvard, and Duke. I could go on and on, but I won't. If you Google her, there'll be about 5 pages, and then there'll be more after that. So that's where we are with Anne Doyle. And I really just want to say, welcome, Anne. Talk to us about leadership. It's 2025 now. Leadership is confusing nowadays. What words do you have to share with us about leadership and powering up today?
Well, thank you, Patty, my longtime friend through the International Women's Forum. And of course, I'm really happy to be here and really happy to talk. And I hope this is a conversation. I'm a master of tough questions, which was my job as a journalist. And so I really hope we can have some tough questions and a good conversation. Yeah, I guess all those things that you mentioned, that's just the fact that I've been working for over 50 years. I'm a baby boomer, and I had a lot of successes, but I also had many failures, many disappointments, many frustrations, but and setbacks. But I think I've learned that you learn from every single one of them. And I also really want to say really upfront to your listeners and anybody here that I know that the workplace has changed dramatically from not only when I entered the workplace, but all of my 5 decades kind of on the front lines of the decades. I mean, the technology has changed, our culture has changed, jobs have changed. But I think one of the really important things that Patty and I have talked about is that, really people haven't changed that much, which is essential in terms of being able to work well, accomplish things together with other people, and the fundamentals of what it takes to be an effective achiever as well. Not only a achiever, but a leader, I think don't change very much at all. And I really believe passionately that we each generation learns from the previous generations and the current generations, and we build on the learnings
Nice.
from the past. And I mean,
I'm
I'm
on a call.
still learning from millennials, and and now from the Gen Zs. But Patty, you had asked me if I would just share a little bit for about 15 minutes or so. And what I thought I would do in terms of this leadership conversation is, number one, talk a little bit more about my background. You kind of gave the highlights of it. I want to share some stories, not just the stories, but what have you learned from those tests? People always want to hear. I don't think you mentioned the fact that I was one of the very first women sports broadcasters, television sports broadcasters, and people always want to hear locker room stories. And so, of course, I will share a locker room story, but also, from the corporate world, and they're examples, I guess, of the ways that I've been tested. And I think one of my big messages is that I really want to encourage people to welcome those tests because those tests, and don't be surprised when you're tested. Just welcome them. You don't always expect them, but they are tremendous learning opportunities. And you really need to welcome them as either a chance to really show you know your stuff, and that's going to lift you to the next level, or they're going to be a mirror reflecting back to you some really valuable information about what you still have to learn. And then I actually just want to touch a little, Patty, on the whole work-life balance issue because that one just doesn't go away, especially for parents. Um, and in terms of my background, I mean, my leadership laboratories, as I call them, began in South Bend, Indiana, uh, where I was the big sister of 7 children. And I had a lot, if you know anything about big families, I had lots of responsibility as a big sister, but I also had plenty of pushback from my younger brothers and sisters who didn't always appreciate their bossy big sister. But my parents were both college graduates. My father, his career was as a radio and television sports broadcaster, and my mother taught speech and debate at Indiana University. So I really was next generation college that was really expected of us. And the thing about for me that I look back and say was an incredible opportunity is that as a baby boomer, I came of age in this country at an incredible time of amazing change. And the Patty, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, this was a moment where all of the work of the civil rights movement, the second wave women's movement that had been going on previously, were sort of like coming to fruition in the early 1970s, where you had a lot of and 60s, where you had some major laws being passed, civil rights legislation, lots of laws related to women's legal rights were being passed. And so here I am coming out of college, my generation, coming out of college at a time of tremendous economic opportunity, which is very different from today, I think. Tremendous economic opportunity because of these laws that jobs that had been legally locked, women and people of color were locked out of jobs for decades. Suddenly those doors were being legally unlocked. And but the really important thing about that is that the doors might have been unlocked, but they were still shut. And you
Mm,
really had to fight hard to pry them open for opportunities, not only for ourselves, those of us who really wanted to fight and get in there, but also to swing them wide for others to come. And I also really want to say that not only was it a time of opportunity that you had to fight for women and people of color, but it was a very challenging time for white men as well for 2 reasons. One is because suddenly they had to compete for jobs that their fathers and grandfathers assumed and culture had assumed were the jobs of white men. And suddenly they had a whole new group of people that they were competing against for those jobs. And then also the men in those jobs who when we started coming in, very few of them had ever worked with women as peers. I mean, they were fathers, they had daughters, they had worked with secretaries and airline stewardesses and teachers, but women as peers, whether it was the corporate world, whether it was journalists, whether it was lawyers, very few of the men at that time had any experience with that. And so there was a lot of interesting resistance. So that's kind of like the context. I hope that's of some value to people. And then quickly, in terms of my, let's say, professional arenas, leadership laboratories, I'm a journalist at my core. And so I'm sort of always looking for what's new. But I started as a radio and television news reporter. Um, Graduating from the University of Michigan, my undergraduate, I was lucky enough, here's an example. lucky enough to get an internship at the National Public Radio Station for the university. My very first day there as an intern, the news director called me over and said, "Hey, are you the new intern here?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he was standing in the door of the newsroom and he looked down at the floor and he pointed at the floor. He said, "You see that line? Yeah, don't you cross it. Don't don't come in here to put something on my desk, to answer the telephone, to read the news wire, because there's no place for a woman in a news department." And
Ah,
yeah, and that's what was going on. What I mean by legally, the doors might have been unlocked, but changing culture and opening opportunities, a whole different piece of it. And there really wasn't anything I could do about that other than just buckle down, do the other things they offered, and get out there and start trying to get a job. And I had multiple news directors tell me basically, "Young lady, I have a piece of advice for you. Get yourself another career because no one will ever listen to a woman on the radio." And look how far we've come. But the
wow.
important thing I want to say about that is that, of course, people did give me opportunities. And the people who gave opportunities were always men because there really were no women in positions to hire me at that time. And that was really being repeated across the culture in many, many, many different professional arenas. And so I started as a radio street reporter, eventually moved into television street reporter, television anchor. I had to either like walk through those doors and face whatever was waiting for me, or I had to walk away. Because, those of us who were in those unique positions at that moment, it wasn't just about whether we would succeed or fail. It was an example of whether women could do that job. And we really felt a lot of responsibility not to fail. And
Okay.
of course, there were lots of tests in there. I can tell other stories about those tests, but I want to give an example of what you were asking about, Patty, in terms of picking your battles.
Yeah.
And
And today, give advice for the people of today, because I think there's a crisis of leadership in every state across the country, in many countries around the world. So, your thoughts on what it's going to take today for leaders to do the right things, to stand up against the tide. Uh, I'd love to hear your advice on those things too, Anne.
yeah, well, I would say that one of my top values of a leader is courage. And I think that's one of my strengths. And I had the opportunity to be tested from a young age to give me the ability to build courage. And one example from the auto industry, I mean, when I got there, there was a lot of pushback. There were a lot. I was moving into a leadership role that women had not had before. There were men who felt I was a token hire, and then I shouldn't have had that opportunity. But the great thing is that I was moved, through the years into a lot of different, a big company like that. If you do well, they'll keep throwing you into deeper water. And so a number of years later, I was in a pretty senior role at Ford Motor Company, and I had a very senior executive pull me aside, and he said, "Hey, Ann, you're doing a great job, and I think you could have a great career here. But I have just one piece of advice for you." And I said, "What's that, Jim?" And he said, "You've got to stop always seeing things through the eyes of a woman." And he said, "People are getting real tired of it." And
Hmm.
I'm like, "Oh, really?" And to me, that was like a, a mirror moment in terms of it was reflecting back to me some important information. And it was also about how I would be viewed as a team player, whether I would be viewed as one of the guys, how well I got along as one of the guys, because of course I was usually the only woman anywhere in the
Right.
areas I was working in. But at that moment, I mean, I felt that I had earned enough credibility that at my moment, it was my responsibility as a leader not to be quiet and fit in, but to speak up and to raise my voice. And I said to him, you know, Jim, I appreciate you telling me that, but if I don't raise my voice, you might as well just have another man in the room because I sit there and wait for someone else to say something about what I can see as the potential impact on our customers and our dealers. And but nobody ever does. And so I go, oh boy, here I have to go again, and they're not going to like it. But I feel very, and I said, I'm not going to stop seeing through the eyes of a woman because I believe that seeing through the eye, that's the whole thing about DEI is really, seeing things through different eyes and the perspective that we bring is added. It's an addition, but it's not always appreciated. It's not always appreciated. And
Hmm.
I'm not, I think people probably would have said I might have been more appreciated if I had been quiet. But I feel really strongly that it's very, very important. Once we've earned the credentials, once we've earned a position of leadership, it's our responsibility not to just sit there, but to help be a positive force for moving culture forward. And that's what I feel about that. I want to say just a couple things about work life, Patty. Um, During my years at Ford, my husband and I had adopted a baby boy. And but we were also going through some very, very difficult times. I married a fantastic guy who unfortunately really, I watched him destroy himself with drugs and alcohol.
Mm.
And I went through a very, very difficult divorce at the time that had a lot of responsibility at work, and I had a very, very young child. And then by the time my son was 7 years old, his father died. He died of cirrhosis of the liver and a cocaine overdose. And I had
Oh
to sit a
God.
little 7-year-old boy down and tell him that his father was gone. And I'm the sole support of my family, obviously, my little family. But I also had a lot of responsibility, and the way I functioned in terms of trying to do all of it was with au pairs who lived with me. But I got a lot of criticism within my own family from some of my sisters. But also I remember there was a teacher at my son's school who I went to pick him up one day, and the teacher said, I've been waiting for you to show up one of these days. And she said, you always have au pairs pick up your son, and you're rarely ever come into the classroom to help. And she said, you're a terrible mother, and you really ought to get your priorities straight.
Mm.
Now, she
Mm.
knew nothing about me. She knew nothing about my life. She knew very little about my son in a lot of ways. But what I want to say to people is my son is 33 years old today. He's a fantastic young man. He and I are very, very close. And we're never going to be perfect in our jobs or as parents, but it is possible to be a really good parent and also, pursue your passions and do a really good job. And I have a friend, you may know her too, Patty, Katie Coleman, who's the astronaut. And Katie has a fantastic new book out called Sharing Space.
Mm.
And she's a member of the International Women's Forum. And she spent 2 months on the International Space Station when her son was 7 years old. And,
Ah,
and of
yeah.
course, she said her father or her husband was, fantastic partner to her. But also, she said, my son was so proud to be able to share with his classmates, you know, talking to his mom in space. And she's a passionate believer in there's lots of ways to be a great parent. So I wanted to say that too. And
Critics are always going to be out there no matter what you do. And in fact, they say that if you're not being criticized by somebody, you're probably not doing enough.
there you go. There you
Right,
go.
right, right.
Yeah.
And I just want to circle back around to something. It was great advice that you got from your dad about be sure to take time to introduce yourself to the team's general managers. First of all, not everybody got that kind of mentoring as they were growing up. And so for you to have a pro in the industry and for him to mentor you that way, I hadn't thought about it, but my dad did something similar to me when
Mm.
I first started my business in 1979, and then a couple years later, we had a partnership, and that partnership broke up. So in 81, I reestablished my same company, but as a sole proprietor, and I needed to borrow some money. In fact, I took a $50,000 mortgage against my house, my equity in my house to do that. And my dad gave me some advice too, similar to your father's advice, but not go introduce yourself to the team's general managers. I was already introducing myself to my customers' general managers, but he said, Patty, go introduce yourself to the bank manager. Or if you bank at a smaller bank, go
Oh,
introduce yourself to the president and
oh,
you say,
oh.
I'd like to open an account, and you hand him that check for $50,000, and you say, I want to buy, I think it was corporate notes or corporate bonds. I don't remember what it was, but I had never heard of it. It was basically an added, it was a way to make extra money over and above a regular savings account, right? So instead,
Yeah.
my dad gave me a business technique that more
Wow.
sophisticated business people use. I love that. And if there's time at the end, and I want to see what questions people have. You may have another story. Dr. Neen had put a question in this, and she said, and I was there when she got her PhD, as a matter of fact, in communications, international communications, and social media. She wants to know how, if you felt it or if you had it, how did you handle imposter syndrome? And so, please, in your remarks, talk a little bit about that if you've witnessed it in others or if you've ever felt it.
Oh my gosh. Don't we all feel that? I mean, absolutely, I felt that. And I would say, especially in terms of sports, when I started in radio, I had never heard a woman's voice do the news on the radio
Hmm.
because there were none. I mean, Barbara Walters was doing the Today Show, but in terms of women doing radio news, I had never heard a woman's voice do that and never seen a woman television news reporter on the streets
Hmm.
covering. And then, of course, in sports, when there was no example for me to watch of what a good television woman sports reporter, how she handled herself, how she dressed, what her style was. And so absolutely, I felt the imposter syndrome. And how do you handle that? I mean, I think obviously I read every single leadership book that there was, everything single book that came out at that time about helping women believe that they could do these jobs and do them well. And I've also just basically said that just keep telling yourself that you do have a right to be there and you have a responsibility to be there and you have a responsibility to do the very best you can. And I guess that's all I can say about it, Patty, in terms of imposter syndrome. I feel really strongly that my other words of advice that my dad gave us was never eliminate yourself. It's really a very simple little mantra. And he told all of his 7 kids the same thing. And he used to say, the world's a very competitive place. And if you're not the best one for the job, you're not the best one for the team or for that moment, the world will not give you the opportunity. They'll eliminate you, they'll fire you, but you don't ever eliminate yourself. And I think that mantra helped me an awful lot in terms of believing that I belonged there. I had a right to be there, and until they fired me, I was going to keep showing up.
Okay. And for me in the 90s, I was in the White House a number of times because of some state chamber of commerce stuff and National Association of Women Business Owners. And being in the White House a number of times in the Bush administration, I remember seeing a typo in in some program that came out of the White House. And I remember feeling so relieved because I was building a growing staffing company at the time, started in the 80s, as you know, and so I would take every mistake so seriously and be worried about it. And so I get to the White House and I see a typo in something in an official meeting. I was quite surprised and a little disappointed, but it also gave me some empowerment. And then in the early 90s, I was very active in California politics. Who was running for governor? Dianne Feinstein was running for governor, and they took her out of the race pretty quickly. And then the people who were working on Feinstein's campaign ended up going to work for the Clinton campaign. A lot of those people I had mentored, there is a point, there is a modern day point to this story. So I don't want you guys to think that we're just talking about history and all we can do is reminisce. This is what old people do. They reminisce about the good old days. But what I learned was in the late 80s and the early 90s is that I was mentoring young people in Los Angeles because they were coming up through the ranks on boards that I was on. They were joining membership committees or joining the boards of directors, and they were working in politics also and coming up through the ranks. And then once Clinton was elected, a lot of those California people, well, they switched over to his campaign and they were in the Clinton White House. And that's when any fears of imposter syndrome left me because I'm like, oh Lordy, I thought people who were running a country were pros. I thought they knew what they were doing. I used to mentor these kids who were still wet behind the ears, you know.
Right.
So anyway, and I found a few more typos and a couple of other things. So that's when I learned that you look around and sometimes you are the best person for the job, even if you feel imperfect or not ready. But pretty much none of us are ready. I've heard the story about you and your son. I was a mom very early also. I don't think any of us were, unless you waited until your late 30s or 40s, none of us are ready for parenthood either, right? And I think, in my opinion, that's like one of the biggest gifts God ever gives us is our children. And he doesn't deliver those with an instruction manual or an app that tells us how to do it, right? So we just have to do it and we have to speak out when we're right. So talk a little bit more about that. How is this relevant today? Okay, I think Phil is going to have a question for us, and Audrey is going to have a question for us also. Anne, are you able to see the chat to see their questions? You want to
Let's
address
see.
those, or I can
I
read them
see
for you?
Audrey. Oops, it disappeared. Can you read it? Let me see if I can.
Okay, so Phil said Phil is an affiliate of ours. He is a fractional COO and a chief financial officer. He entered General Motors in 1983. Okay, and he worked with a number of females that he had a lot of respect
Oh,
for, and so he said it was relatively easy since they were engineers and they helped train him. What did you do at Ford and how did it shape your career path? Oh, yeah. He
oh
wants to know a little
gosh.
bit more about.
Oh, that's great. And you said 1983. Is that right, Phil?
That's right.
Yeah. Hi. Are you an engineer? Is that where were you at Ford? I mean, General Motors.
Here in the Atlanta area in Doryville, but I traveled a lot to the GM Tech Center and did a lot of work up there.
Okay, okay. Well, I joined Ford in 1987, in January of 1987. So just a couple of years after that. And so we probably know maybe some similar people. I had a lot of
Mhm.
friends, obviously, at General Motors. But what's the question, I guess?
How did that shape your career?
Ford Motor Company? Uh,
Yes.
well, in terms of, well, I'll share. I mean, of course, I mean, that was really chapter two for me. So I had already been a radio and television news and then sports reporter for, let's see, 15 years by the time I came into Ford Motor Company. And I was handling my job in public affairs, um, is facing off with the global news media. And then I spent a few years, 3 years on the governmental affairs side, primarily in Washington, D.C., in terms of all kinds of legislation, CAFE, NATO, all of that. stuff. Um, I'll tell a story about when I first arrived at Ford that might be interesting and I think is relevant in terms of people moving from, maybe one job or even different arenas. And that is when I first got to Ford Motor Company. I'd only been there a couple of weeks, and I was coming in as the manager of the broadcast news office, which was a brand new office in terms of public affairs, because before that, all of the people who worked in communications at Ford Motor Company and faced off with the news media were newspaper or buff book journalists. They either were working for the Wall Street Journal or different newspapers, or they were working for Car and Driver, Road and Track, and interfacing like that. But television was becoming very, very important at that time. And so they needed people who understood TV and how to prepare our executives for that. And so I'd only been there a couple of weeks, and my boss said, "Hey, Anne, Mr. Pastillo wants to see you." And Pete Pastillo. And I said, "Well, who's that?" And he said, "He's a senior executive at the company, reports to the CEO. You better get up and see him." And I'm like, "Okay." So I went up to the top floor of world headquarters of Ford Motor Company, and they escort me into his gigantic office. And we sit down. He offered me a cup of coffee. We sit down, and start talking, and he starts talking to me about sports. And we're talking about sports. And he's asking me all kinds of questions and asking me my opinion, this and that. And after about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, his executive assistant knocks on the door and basically says, "Oh, Mr. Pastillo, your next meeting is here." And I was like being time to go. And I said, "Pete, is there anything that you wanted from me?" And he said, "No, I just want to know what you knew about sports." And it turns out that he was a gigantic Boston Red Sox fan. And he told me years later that he read the sports pages before he read the Wall Street Journal. And to me, and he became a huge ally of mine and a sponsor in terms of leadership roles through the years. And my point about that is, what I learned from that is that credentials are transferable. He wanted to know if I had any credibility as a sports reporter. And years later, he would tease me and he would say to me, "Ann, you just don't know as much about sports as you used to know." And I would laugh and say, "Yeah, but I know a hell of a lot more about the auto industry now, Pete." And
Awesome.
and the point is that our skills are transferable, even into very, very different arenas. And so I really encourage people to remember that, even when they're thinking about making a big jump to a very, very different area.
Anne,
Thank you.
thank you, Phil. Great question. Um, Anne has offered to have a consult if somebody wants to have a half hour or so session with her for leadership. We can put you in touch with Anne. She graciously offered to do that. She's not in the business of being a business coach, although I've been trying to twist her arm for years to be part of our team, and I at least got her on this, so our leadership power hour. So Audrey Addison Williams, Audrey is an advocate, a speaker, an evangelist, a spokesperson for a lot of people in the United States and in other countries. And Audrey, your question was, we live and work in an environment that's quite different than it was even at the turn of the century, 2000, right? So how do we navigate this toxic and often hostile culture? Now, Audrey mentioned in her question, she said workplace culture, but I think it's also in the community. Now that I'm semi-retired, I am out in the community a lot more, and I just see so much polarization in politics and just hate spewed at the other party. So how do we see things more clearly without the partisanship lenses or the toxic lenses of the differences that we have, and pull out the best of the things that we share in common and that we need for the future? Anne, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I have two thoughts on that. I mean, one goes back to my experience things that I learned in terms of going into locker rooms where I was not wanted at all.
Mhm.
And even into the press boxes that the other journalists did not, male journalists did not want me there, because they were afraid that if I insisted on the opportunities to go in the locker rooms would be closed to everybody and that they would lose their access. So they were very hostile. They were not protective. But the other piece I want to share is even in my own family, bring you right up to speed today. I'm from a big family and we have partisan political differences. And so what I would say about the first thing in terms of in that I had to learn that I knew that I had a job to do, to go into those environments where I was not wanted and it could be pretty hostile. With my own teams, the home teams that you cover day in, day out, you start to build trust, you start to build credibility. People are always watching. There are tests and people watch to see how you pass those tests. But then you have to force yourself to go into the visiting team's locker rooms and walk into the New York Yankees locker room, and it's you're not welcome there at all. And how to just handle yourself as a professional. Um, don't get triggered by the even the hostile stuff that comes at you, and to just do your job. That's what I did there when you're in a really hostile situation that you're supposed to be there. But in terms of most recently, I just had family members come to visit for my birthday, and a sister and a brother who hadn't been in my house in a while. And they came, and my son and I both talked about the fact that I am we're not going to focus at all. We're going to avoid all those landmines. We know where they are. They know where they are. And if it comes up, we're not going to let ourselves be triggered by it or sucked in by it. But the third thing was that we're really going to try to focus on the wonderful things about those people, and not to just zero in on those differences between us and just completely put those aside. And I was really proud of my son, who's 33, and the way that he turned on his charm. He did his very best to build a positive relationship there, and that was all about focusing on setting aside and don't engage in those conversations about the differences, and really focusing on all the great qualities that they had. And that's what I'm trying to do right now in this environment, because I think for a while it just it stopped relationships. You just stopped talking to family members. You stopped talking to friends because it was too dangerous. But that's not what we want either. We have to talk to each other.
Right. It's a little bit lazy sometimes to stand by silently, right? So if you're silent in the face of injustice, you're complicit, or you could be considered complicit. Yeah, I think we have to keep knowing the ways to move forward. We have to continue to stand up for what we believe to be the kinder, more visionary way that benefits more people. Obviously, there are partisan differences that people have. Um, Ken had a question here. Oh, this is interesting, Ken. When do you say that question? Because I'm looking for the
Yeah, I
tone
think
on
I
here.
think I can set it up too. Hi, Ann. Thanks so much. This is Ken Copel
Hi.
here. Thanks so much for
Hi.
your presentation. I've been eating it up. And Patty said, ask a question. I got to ask a question. Here's how I can, I'm also a baby boomer, so I can relate to that. But the question that I put in the notes is like, oh, has it ever, looking back, has it ever benefited you to have had a chip on your shoulder? And the reason I phrase it this way is that when I was starting in my career, people said, "Oh, you'll love this when you're older." Now I'm older. I don't know if I love it, but I always looked really young. So when I was in my 20s and my 30s, I looked like I was 12, and people would just judge me. I was creative director of New York ad agency, and I would go into a client meeting, and I would bring my account executive with me who looked older than me, and the clients would just talk to that person. They wouldn't even give me eye contact. And so,
Ooh.
just looking like a kid through a lot of my adult life. Um, I kind of I it forced me to kind of overcompensate. And it's like, okay, well, I have something to prove. I can actually do this. I might look like I'm 12, but I have something to prove. And so I can feel kind of a kinship. And looking back on it, it's like that helped me. It gave me a little kick in the butt that, I didn't have it easy. So I'm wondering if you can relate to that. And looking back, did that ever show up as a quality of yours? And do those signposts align now that you look at them in the rearview mirror?
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and I hadn't really thought about that. And my son also complains about that a lot. That he says that he looks so young, and that it's someday you'll really appreciate that, but when you're first starting out, I think you know um but yeah, that's exactly how certainly I felt as a woman, in terms of, you've been hearing these stories for decades about, the only woman in the room being asked to take the notes, or being asked to go get the coffee, or being, assumed that, the guy who came in with her was her boss rather than the other way around. All of those assumptions. And I agree with you, Ken. I think in some ways, uh, it's irritating. You get in, but that it does force you to sort of like kick it up to a higher level to prove that you do belong there. And that's what I would say. But I wouldn't call it a chip on your shoulder, because you turned that little chip actually into a strength, in terms of saying, oh, hey, that's almost like one of those mirror moments that I like to talk about, when there's a reflection back to you that, yeah, I got to do something else here to take myself to the next level, so that they see me as the leader that I am, or the person in this job that I am. And so a lot of times I think those little chips on your shoulder, I mean, you notice it. And so it's irritating, and maybe you call that a chip. But instead of being pissed off about it, that you
Mhm.
turn it into feedback for you and kick yourself to the higher level.
I love how you take the high road and see the crisis as an opportunity. Thanks for that answer, Anne. Beautifully put.
Yeah, it's taken me a long time to do that, believe me.
Yeah, you have to look back to see it.
Oh my gosh, we keep learning. We definitely keep learning. Yeah,
Hey, Anne,
yeah.
in a minute, I want you to kind of summarize a few key takeaways that you want people to leave with. And we do have a free gift for those of you who stay till the end if you would like it. But I want to tell one quick story about being having a chip on my shoulder. And I thought about when Ken first asked the question. First of all, Ken, I'm going to get you the friendly violins because you poor baby, you looked young. We would all love to have that problem now.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Anyway, I was one of the early outsourcing companies in Los Angeles. There was a political change. Republicans came into the LA County Board of Supervisors. They looked at all the benefits and all the spending, and they were quite concerned that LA County was possibly going to go bankrupt because of the obligations of the pensions and the cost of all the burden with all the government employees and the unions. And in fact, about 15 years later, Orange County did file for bankruptcy, so it wasn't unusual. So they said anything we can outsource, we want to outsource. So there was a huge amount of union resistance to outsourcing. They did not want to out, so I had vendors like me coming in and saying, "Oh, we can hire for you. Oh, we can fill those positions." You should have seen what happens when I once offered to end the dock workers strike. It was like a disaster, but I did talk to the elected officials and I said, if I end this strike by supplying you with people, you're going to have to provide me protection for the next year because I think they're going to come and try to put a hit out on me, right?
Almost your house.
But we had a contract with the Department of Probation, and there were a number of people who were actively working to sabotage our contract. We were staffing a number of facilities at the juvenile halls, and we knew that we had a customer that was unhappy with us. And so in the government contracting, you have to pass the elected officials, you have to pass contracting, you have to pass risk management. The elected officials have to like you, the departments have to like you, and then the users right next, those people who work next door. So there's like 8 levels of command where you can get screwed up, or those rings that you have to kiss along the way. And so I loved government contracting because the barrier to entry was so high. Most people gave up when they figure I can't jump through all those hoops. But after about 6 months of a brand new contract here, they had decided that we were failing and they had a lot of criticism of us. But each and every criticism that they had, we had addressed along the way. And I got called into a meeting. There were 8 people around the board member, and there was the head of the probation department for Los Angeles County. He looked like Khrushchev. I remember that. And I got called in, like he wanted to scold me publicly in front of all these people. And the county psychiatrist was there. He was the worst saboteur. One of the supervisor, he was a sexual predator. He was there. All these guys were there. So every one of them knew what they had done to me, and I was the only female in the room. And so eventually I listened because I was a good kid. I was taught to be respectful, and the customer is always right. And I listened, and I wasn't defensive, but I answered questions. And finally he started criticizing the way we were recruiting. And I said, "Excuse me, sir, I am a professional recruiter. There is a process to be followed, and I don't expect people who are not recruiters for a living to necessarily understand or appreciate that process. But in order for me to get the people that you need that work in your unique environment, we have to cast a very wide, wide net." We had been advertising in the paper for people that typed 35 words a minute. Our contract said a minimum of 40 words a minute. Somebody had pulled that out, and thought he was going to slay me for advertising for 35. I said, "Sir, if you'd ever learned to type, you realize that if you can type 35 words a minute with 2 hours of practice, you can now type 40 words a minute. And with 3 days of practice, you can now type 55 words a minute. Did you know that?" No, I didn't know that. So I had to educate him in that. And then he was going to beat me up on something else. And the psychiatrist said, "Yeah, and you just screwed up here, and you did that, and you did that." Well, just so happened that I knew he was complaining because he'd been complaining to everybody, and my people had reported that to me. And so I had tried to reach him 3 times. I became on a first name basis with his assistant. And when he decided to pile on in that meeting, I said, um, whatever his name was, Dr. Castillo, I said, "When I called Sally, she said this. On this day, I called Sally for the second time, and I gave her my home phone number. Dr. Castillo, if it was so bad, why didn't you call me at home?" Anyway, so finally having that chip on my shoulder and standing up for myself won me the respect of the people in that room. And I educated them on our practice. I did that, and we kept those contracts for many, many more years. Now, hey, eventually we walked away from those $1 million contracts because of George, who was a sexual predator, but that's beside the point. Anyway,
That's a springboard moment. That's what I'm
yeah,
talking about.
yeah, yeah,
The
yeah.
good test
Oh
that
gosh,
took
we
you to
are.
a higher level.
This is a copy of Anne's book. If you would like a copy of the book, put something in the comments and I will send you this copy of Anne's book. And Anne, you get the closing comments. So
Okay, well, I guess if there's anything I want people to really remember, it's to number one, expect to be tested because don't be surprised when you are, and really welcome those opportunities, such as the one Patty just described to you. They're opportunities for growth, and if you don't do so well, it's fantastic feedback about how you can do better. And if you nail it, it's going to springboard you to the next level. It's going to build your confidence. Wise mentors, absolutely essential. Look for them. There's allies everywhere once you build credibility, and you have to earn their respect first. But I would also say, be hungry, be ambitious, be impatient for opportunity. But it's equally important to master all the fundamentals that haven't changed about building your skills, earning credibility, showing up, meeting your deadlines, not just accepting criticism even when it hurts, but ask for it. ask for constructive criticism. And as my father always said, never, ever, ever eliminate yourself. Go for it.
Because you might be the most qualified person for the job, given all the circumstances. And we never know all the circumstances, do we? Yeah.
We never know.
Thank you guys so much. Erica, if you wish to have a private session with Anne and you can talk to her about AI and other things, we just let us know. We will set that up. Thank you guys. If you'd like to connect with Anne later, just reach out to us and we will do that. Or you can find her. She lives in Auburn Hills. She's no longer a city council member. So,
I have a website. Can I mention my website,
oh,
which
please do.
is,
Yes. Uh-huh. Yes.
yeah, it's simply www.annedoyleleadership.com. I'll see you there.
AnneDoyleLeadership.com. Good. I'm putting it in the
Thank you, Anne. Thank you.
and thank you, Tracy, for being on here. It's great
Thank
to
you.
see you. I look forward to talking to you over the next couple of days. I look forward to catching up with you all. And keep on being the leader that you are. Remember, your resilience is needed and it's important. Your voice is important. And doing the right thing, even when nobody else is looking, is what made this country better. And you can make today's world even better by doing that. Thank you all. Bye now.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye, everybody. Bye, Patty.
Bye. Great to see you.